I love the Associated Press. You love the Associated Press. Whether or not you are aware of how much you love them, the fact is that if you are at all a news junkie, if you're reading over the course of your typical day, you are basically marinating in Associated Press content all day long. The AP is everywhere. The AP is jointly owned by the American news organizations who use their stuff, and that means thousands of newspapers and TV stations and radio stations. They have hundreds of news bureaus all over the world. They have staff all over the world. They're the only news organization, for example, with a bureau in North Korea, for crying out loud. By dint of sheer size, the Associated Press is just indispensable. They're everywhere. But because they are everywhere, because their content is ubiquitous and used by so many news outlets, when the Associated Press does something bad, it's really bad. It isn't like one newspaper printing one lousy story. If it's the AP, it's one bad story that ends up in a zillion different newspapers and websites and TV stations and radio stations. So, for example, when the Associated Press published just a shockingly bad article about Kansas politics this past week, it did not just end up in some tragic little Kansas newspaper. It ended up in the Kansas City Star, and in the Fresno Bee, and in the Charlotte Observer, and in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and in the Miami Herald, and the State in South Carolina, and in the Times-Pic in Louisiana, and in the Seattle Times, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and in the Connecticut Post, and the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and. All of these papers or their websites and all of the aggregator websites running an eye-popping Associated Press story that never should have run anywhere. Dr. George Tiller was murdered in Kansas 3 years ago when the anti-abortion activist who killed him was pulled over by police right after the killing. The murderer had in his car the name and phone number of the policy director of Operation Rescue written on a piece of paper on his dashboard. Operation Rescue, the radical anti-abortion group. The Associated Press on Friday published a piece about the Kansas primaries this week, focusing on the district attorney's race in Wichita, where Dr. Tiller was killed. The AP notes that the incumbent DA, a Democrat named Nola Fulston, is stepping down, and no Democrat is running to replace her. It was just two anti-abortion Republicans who campaigned for Nola Fulston's old seat in the Tuesday primary in Kansas. Reporter Roxana Hegeman, reporting for the Associated Press, writes in this piece that it is a liability for one of these two Republican candidates that he has been a deputy in the DA's office he's now running to be put in charge of. Why would that be a liability, to be a deputy district attorney? Why would that be bad? It's because, the Associated Press explains, people blame the current district attorney for the murder of George Tiller. What? This is just astonishing. Look at this. This is quoting directly from the AP's story. Look at this. It's important to note that Scott Roeder, the abortion opponent serving a life sentence for killing Dr. George Tiller, once told the Associated Press that he believed Dr. Tiller would never be brought to justice as long as Nola Fulston was in office. Brought to justice? That's not in quotes or anything. That's just the Associated Press describes it uncritically. He was never brought to justice. Continuing. The district attorney, Nola Fulston, had refused to allow then Attorney General Phil Klein to prosecute Dr. Tiller in her jurisdiction, resulting in a judge dismissing charges that the doctor had performed illegal late-term abortions. While Fulston has insisted she was simply upholding the law, many abortion opponents blame her for derailing Klein's prosecution and ultimately for Dr. Tiller's death. If Nola Fulston had done her job with George Tiller, he would still be alive today, said Troy Newman, president of Wichita-based Operation Rescue. Operation Rescue quoted as a credible observer in this case. Oh yes, the blame for the doctor being shot to death by the anti-abortion activist with ties to Operation Rescue lies with the district attorney who didn't prosecute that doctor for something or other. He didn't get prosecuted, so obviously he had to be shot. So says Operation Rescue, and so writes down the Associated Press, thus resulting in newspapers all over the country printing this absolutely wackadoo, uncontested, more than insinuation that an abortion doctor was murdered in Kansas because, what, he needed killing? Because he hadn't been brought to justice? Incidentally, the assistant DA from Nola Fulston's office won the primary on Tuesday in Kansas, but that is not what this is about. Generally speaking, I love the Associated Press, and you probably do too, but the AP besmirched Tuesday's Kansas primary with this trash that they published about it this past Friday. I haven't said anything about it to now because I keep expecting them to retract it. So far, nothing. Before this week is out, the Associated Press ought to retract what they published, and they ought to apologize.